Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're gonna be reviewing the album Trout Replica by Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band. Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog. So yeah, I was saving these ones for a while and I think it's finally the right time to use them because honestly, I really don't see any other album that really requires this type of vision blocking or something like that. Anyway, here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
For a week, well, I put down my bush and I took off my pants and felt free. The breeze blowing up me and up the canyon.
Three little children with doves on their shoulders, their eyes roll back in ecstasy, crying, "Please, old man, stop this misery."
Right, just dig it.
That's right, the Mascara snake, fast and bulbous.
3 hours late, out on my floor. I remember my childhood.
Fast and bulbous.
That's right, the Mascara snake, fast and bulbous.
Bulbous also tapered.
Yeah, but you've got to wait until I say. Also, a tin teardrop. The H on my faucet, there's no bed for my mouse. I punch and grow mine was in Diamondback time now.
Oh, Trout Replica. You know, on this list we have some albums that are definitely not progressive rock, but they're just sort of novelty albums that have to make an appearance on here, and what better of a novelty album do we have than Trout Replica by no other than Captain Beefheart and of course his Magic Band. Now this is an album that presumably was always in people's minds, at least for those who sought after it, but I don't think that it really broke through popular media up until recently, specifically in 2010 when the album was added to the Library of Congress and with the media coverage that it got over on YouTube by Anthony Fantano and Vox in 2017. And specifically in 2017, that was also when I was first introduced to this album, but back in the time I didn't go ahead and listen to the entire album, though I do distinctly remember hearing Frownland and knowing something about the quote fast and bulbous. But here I am today for the first time actually listening to this entire album and reviewing it, and well, this album was actually not originally in my plan for reviewing it this year, but you lovely views of 365 Days of Prog decided to vote this one to be on the list, and well, I am your servant, I'm gonna do it. So I listened to it in its entirety in one sitting, and now I'm gonna try and start to detail what this thing is. And I think that the best place to start really has to be with the person behind it all. Now you might know the person behind this album is no other than Captain Beefheart, but the truth of the matter is that his birth name is actually Don Glenn Vliet, and he was born in Glendale, California all the way back in 1941. Now by the age of 3, Glenn Vliet was also showing some really promising artistic traits, specifically in the fields of painting and sculpting, and well, by the time that he was 11 he was already proving to be a child prodigy, and he worked with various artists even at a young age, and he received several scholarship offers, but unfortunately his parents found his obsession with sculpting to be quite queer, as they say, so they disallowed them all. Now also growing up, Glenn Vliet would also develop develop his instinct sense of liking music, especially everything that had to do with eclecticism. And from the various artists that he used to listen to when he was young, I know none of them except for Muddy Waters. Now, Glenn Fleet himself actually never learned how to play an instrument, at least not properly, but growing up he did make friends with several bands, specifically two that you should remember are the Blackouts and the Omens. Now, I will emphasize this one more time. We have a lot of detail about growing up of Glenn Fleet, but honestly, a lot of it was told by him, and his stories are quite wacky and nonsensical at times, and oftentimes they can be disputed or at least twisting reality to some extent, with one of those stories being him telling that his extent of formal education in his life concludes in only half a day at a kindergarten. But some of the things that we do know about Glenn Fleet and can confirm their truthfulness have to come from people who knew him or still know him, with one of them being the drummer for the band that I mentioned, the Blackouts, which you might know as Frank Zappa. Back at the time when the two got together and actually became friends, Frank was doing these sort of field recordings of his where he would basically record things out there, pieces of music, people talking and whatnot, and in one fateful day, alongside with his brother Bobby who played the guitar, the first ever known recording of Glenn Fleet was made, basically him sort of singing over a guitar tune. And well, the two teenagers decided to keep on making pieces of sound together. I'm really avoiding saying music on here because I don't really know to what extent was this any type of music per se. But the two did go on in the process of creation together when Glenn Fleet decided to change his name to Van Vliet for some reason, and he also joined the Magic Band. Now, the Magic Band was actually formed by two ex-members of the Omens, so that's how everything ties up. Now, as I said, Van Vliet was no skilled musician. He never really learned how to play adequately on any given instrument, really, and while he did play some on his works, he didn't really know what he was doing. And well, when creating his music, the process would go something like this. He would sit next to his piano and just jamble around things, try out new things, and then give his own ideas to the rest of the band and expect them to transcribe into their own individual instruments, a task which was oftentimes proving to be really difficult to the point of impossibility. But these guys in his Magic Band were basically very talented, so they usually made do. Now, when starting off his musical career with his Magic Band, Captain Beefheart really didn't find a lot of people who wanted to take in his style of music, and one of the suggestions he got was to change his name to a better sounding stage name, which was when he finally settled on the stage name of Captain Beefheart. Now, you'll have to excuse me for what I'm gonna do right now, but I'm gonna shorten history to one really short sentence. So, in the year of 1967, Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band released their first studio album called Safe as Milk, and in 1968 they released their second called Strictly Personal. Yeah, there's so much that can be said about those two. You can make full multiple hours documentaries on these two, but that's all I'm gonna say about them. And for our intents and purposes, in 1969 they came back with their third studio album called Trout, Replica. Now, in my personal assessment, I think that there are three main components that made this album be what it was, with the first one being that this album came out on Captain Beefheart's own established label, which was called Straight Records, and this label by himself basically allowed him to do whatever he wanted and to go as absurd as he wanted, and basically not have any restrictions from an external source. Now, the second reason, and probably most obvious reason for why this album is so special, are the compositions to be found on it. Specifically, this album has 28 tracks on it, and of course it's a double album. And as I detailed already, Captain Beefheart would jumble around his piano, give the ideas to the rest of the band, and when they told him that they didn't know what to do with them, that they were impossible, he would say, you're suffering, I have to write this shit. And I think that thirdly, and to some extent really important reason for why this album also works, is because people were prepared for this type of thing. Now, with that being said, I do have to mention Frank Zappa once again. Zappa took a big part in the creation of this album, and you can definitely see it or hear it on the final recording, seeing as he appears in many different places, in dialogues, and singing, and whatnot, and laughing. And well, Frank Zappa already somewhat established the grounds for this type of music with the Mothers of Invention before it, and when by the time that Captain Beefheart broke out with Trout Replica, people were already already starting to understand this type of music per se. But yeah, that's where I'm gonna stop this one. This is the oh so brief summary of this album and its history, but for when it comes down to it, what did I think of this album? So firstly, I'll tell you that before getting into this one, I thought that this was gonna be absurd, avant-garde, very out there, so odd and wacky to no real merit for its critical acclaim. But when I got into this album, I started realizing why people were attracted to this one. Yes, I don't think that this album is that good, but I do see some merit behind its existence. You see, this album starts off with the now iconic Frownland, a very disjointed and confused song that would make the shags shiver, but by the end of it, it actually concludes with a song like Veterans Day Poppy, which is much more tame, a lot more bluesy, and much more normal. Now, when it comes down to it, these normal tracks to be found on this album, which there is somewhat of an abundance of them towards the end of it, are my least favorite tracks from this album, because as I see them, they don't have the uniqueness that most of this album really portrays, and as they stand, they just sound like really bad blues or country or bluegrass songs that really don't have any worth of existence. Songs that personally did bark up my alley had to be the weirder ones, but the ones that also had some listening enjoyment to them at least. And in that category we have songs like Dakao Blues or Ella Guru, or even later on with Penna, and my personal favorite from the album, Sugar and Spikes. Now here's a funny thing, I didn't realize this up until this moment when I actually said the name of this track, but I didn't really understand that this was a wordplay on the saying sugar and spice. I just kind of took it as what it was. So yeah, and it's a really lovely track, by the way. I really enjoyed its absurdity, I liked the instrumentation, and I liked a lot of things about it, and honestly, as I said, I'm pretty surprised to find songs like this that I genuinely enjoy on this one. Now this album has some different songs to say the least. There are at least 4 songs on this album which have literally no instrumentation and only Captain Beefheart sort of doing this semi-spoken word / singing vibe to him. He just says things out loud, he makes mistakes, and they just make it to the final cut because that's the part of the aesthetic. But in a different sense, this album also has the purely instrumental tracks on here, and for what it's worth, I think they're also pretty fine, but again, nothing really stellar. But to sum things up, I think that the only way to really get this album is of course by giving it a listen, and honestly I did so with one sitting, and I don't encourage anyone to do that. I think that the proper dose for an album like this has to be like a single or maybe 2 songs per day. Really, you know, take them in, enjoy them if you can, and move on when you're ready. But all in all, is this album a masterpiece? Absolutely freaking not. It's not a masterpiece, but I do get why it does encapsulate some sort of uniqueness in human creation, and why we should definitely preserve this type of sound, even if though no one really thinks that it's your average pop rock music that you just like to jam around to. But as it stands, it's a unique album, and if there's one thing more unique than the music itself, it has to be this album's cover. So yes, this album's cover is just amazing, and it has to be a big component to why this album works and why it became so popular, because it is just so freaking iconic. And of course, with this cover being so iconic as it is, it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume who made this, and yes, you guessed it right, it was no other than Kat Schenkel. Now, if you somehow don't know who Kat Schenkel is, he's basically the creator behind most of Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention's album's covers, and he honestly does amazing works that they're very eclectic, much like the music to be found on here. But as it stands, this cover basically features Captain Beefheart with the mask of a trout wearing an old pilgrim's hat and having his very furry greenish coat on him that has become also quite iconic with his figure. But honestly, as it stands, on this series I talk a lot about album covers having to portray the music of the album they're representing, and to what extent this cover actually makes do with the music. It's just immaculate. I have to say this. This music is so hard to capture in image form, yet Kat Schenkel did the most perfectest thing ever and created this cover after all, and honestly I don't think anyone could have done a better job. And when it comes to a case of an album's music fitting its cover art, this is just a 100% perfect case. And as it stands, while I don't think that this album is that great to begin with, I do find that I would like to own a copy of this one, maybe for the novelty, maybe to just hang it on the wall and have people look at it, I don't know, but it's just so freaking cool. But yeah, this album, it's not perfect and it might be deserving of a 5, but today I'm just feeling quite generous, so I'm gonna give it a rating of 6 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be listening to something completely different, by the way, and that's Space Revolver by the Flower Kings. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay, Warner, Rist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.